The Vanishing Ballet Troupe. A Father's Endless Grief. Rick Holloway sat on his worn-out recliner, the same one he had used for over 3 decades, staring at the flickering television screen in his dimly lit living room. The room had once been filled with the sounds of laughter, the patter of tiny feet, and the soft hum of ballet music playing in the background. Now it was a museum of sorrow, a place where time had frozen since the disappearance of his only daughter, Claire, 31 years ago. His younger brother, Daniel, sat across from him, sipping his coffee in silence. The two had made it a habit to meet every Saturday, reminiscing about their past and skirting around the subject of Claire's disappearance. But tonight felt different. The air was thick with unspoken words, the kind of silence that held weight. Rick's gaze drifted to a small glass cabinet tucked in the corner of the room. Inside, neatly displayed, was a pair of tiny pink ballet slippers. They had once belonged to Claire. They were one of the only things Rick had left of her, a painful yet cherished reminder of the daughter he had lost. As if sensing the shift in mood, Daniel's 5-year-old daughter, Tasha, bounded into the room, her eyes bright with curiosity. She clutched a juice box in one hand and twirled clumsily on the carpet. "Uncle Rick," she chirped, pointing at the cabinet. "Those are ballet shoes. Can I see them?" Rick hesitated, his fingers twitching slightly. He had avoided touching those shoes for years, but before he could respond, Daniel gave him a reassuring nod. Slowly, he got up, walked over to the cabinet, and unlocked it with a trembling hand. The shoes were small, almost delicate, with faded pink satin ribbons. As he lifted them, memories surged. Claire twirling in the living room, giggling as she tried to balance on her toes, practicing for her very first recital. He swallowed hard and turned to Tasha, offering her the slippers. "Here," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Tasha eagerly slipped one foot inside, then frowned. "They're too small," she said, looking up at him. "But they have bows, just like mine." Rick's breath caught in his throat. Bows. He turned the shoe over in his hand. He had forgotten about the small embroidered bows that Claire had insisted be sewn onto them. She had always said they made her feel like a princess. Daniel watched him closely. "Rick, you okay?" Rick barely heard him. His mind was spinning. His gaze snapped to the television screen, where a live ballet performance was playing. A charity event featuring some of the world's most elite dancers. His eyes widened as the camera panned across the dancers' feet. Among the perfectly polished ballet slippers was a pair unlike the rest, a pair with tiny bows. His heart nearly stopped. The familiar detail. Rick lunged for the remote, rewinding the footage to the moment the camera had zoomed in on the dancers' feet. There it was again. The same distinctive bows, identical to the ones on Claire's slippers. He turned to Daniel, his hand shaking. "Dan, look at this." Daniel frowned, leaning in. "What am I supposed to see?" "The bows," Rick said urgently. "Look at the shoes. Do you remember Claire's ballet slippers? She was the only girl in her class who had bows on hers." Daniel studied the image on the screen, his expression skeptical. "Rick, it's been 31 years. Are you sure you're not seeing what you want to see?" Rick clenched his fists. "No, I know what I'm seeing. That dancer, she has to be Claire." Daniel sighed. "Rick, even if it was her, don't you think the police would have found her by now? I mean, it's not like she could just disappear off the face of the earth." Rick's jaw tightened. Maybe she didn't disappear. Maybe she was taken. Daniel exhaled, rubbing his temples. "All right, let's say, for argument's sake, that she was taken. What do you think happened to her all these years?" Rick shook his head, his thoughts spiraling. "I don't know, Dan, but I'm going to find out." Daniel ran a hand through his hair, glancing at his daughter, who was now sitting on the floor, humming to herself. He looked back at Rick and saw the fire in his brother's eyes, the same determination that had driven him to spend the last 3 decades searching for answers. "What are you going to do?" Daniel asked. Rick didn't hesitate. I'm going to the police." A cold case reopened. The police station was eerily quiet for a Saturday night. Rick sat across from Officer Jones, a grizzled veteran who had worked on Claire's case in the early days of her disappearance. The man sighed as he rubbed his temples, clearly exhausted. "Rick, I understand why you're here," Jones said, his voice heavy with sympathy. "But it's been 31 years. There haven't been any new leads." Rick leaned forward, slamming his fists onto the desk. "Look at this." He shoved his phone across the table, showing the paused footage of the ballet dancer. "Look at the bows on those shoes. Claire was the only one who wore them like that." "It's her. I know it." Jones studied the image for a long moment before sighing. "It's a coincidence, Rick. There are plenty of dancers out there, plenty of ballet shoes with bows." Rick shook his head furiously. "No, you don't get it. That's not a normal thing. Bows make it harder to dance. Claire was obsessed with them. She made her coach let her wear them." Jones exhaled, clearly torn. "Even if it was her, what do you expect us to do? Walk into a professional ballet company and demand a DNA test?" "Yes," Rick said bluntly. Jones sighed again. "Rick, listen to me. If we investigate every lead that comes from a gut feeling, we'd be chasing ghosts. Unless you have concrete proof, I can't open a formal investigation." Rick's heart sank. He had spent decades hoping for this moment, only to be brushed aside like every other time. He clenched his jaw. If the police weren't going to help, then he would have to do this on his own. As he left the station, determination set in his bones. He was going to find out the truth, no matter what it took. The Kendrick Grand Theater. That night, Rick sat in front of his computer, searching for anything he could find about the ballet company. After hours of digging, he found what he was looking for: the name of the venue where the dancers had performed. The Kendrick Grand Theater, a prestigious ballet school and performing arts academy, known for producing some of the most talented dancers in the world. But what caught Rick's attention wasn't their reputation. It was their secrecy. Few interviews, no background information on their dancers. Everything about them was carefully controlled. And then he found a name that made his breath catch in his throat. Celeste Kendrick, the dancer with the bow-adorned shoes. Age: 35. Rick's hands trembled. Claire would be 35 now. This was it. This was the lead he had been waiting for. He grabbed his keys and his phone, heart pounding in his chest. It was time to find out the truth. Into the shadows. Rick's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as he sped down the dimly lit streets of the city. His heartbeat thundered in his ears, his mind replaying the image of the dancer with the delicate bows on her slippers. Every instinct inside him screamed that he had found Claire. After 3 decades of hopeless searching, dead ends, and shattered dreams, he had seen something he never expected to see again. It had to be her. It had to be. The Kendrick Grand Theater loomed ahead, its towering structure bathed in an eerie glow from the streetlights. The grand architecture, with its ornate arches and golden embellishments, stood like a fortress of secrets, hiding something, or someone, inside. Rick barely registered the security cameras positioned at every corner, the motion-sensitive lights that flickered on as he parked his car a safe distance away. He wasn't about to waltz through the front doors and demand answers. No, if there was one thing he had learned in the army, it was how to be patient, how to wait, how to strike when the time was right. Taking a deep breath, he pulled out his phone, fingers flying across the screen as he sent a quick message to Daniel. "Rick, I'm at the Kendrick Grand Theater. If I don't check in every 15 minutes, call the cops." There was no response yet, but Rick wasn't waiting. He shoved the phone into his jacket pocket, inhaled sharply, and stepped out of the car. The night air was thick and humid, the distant hum of city life, a low murmur in the background. The parking lot was nearly empty save for a few luxury cars parked near the back entrance. Whoever these people were, they weren't struggling for money. Rick made his way toward the side of the building. his boots crunching softly against the gravel. He kept his body low, slipping through the shadows, careful not to draw attention to himself. His military training kicked in instinctively. Move swiftly, stay quiet, observe everything. He stopped near a row of windows, peering inside. The grand hall was dimly lit, chandeliers casting elongated shadows across the velvet-carpeted floors. In the center of the room stood a group of ballet dancers, their postures straight, their movements disciplined as they practiced their routines under the watchful eyes of an older man in a fitted suit. Rick's breath caught in his throat. There she was, the woman with the bows. She was standing in the center of the room, poised like a porcelain doll, her face unreadable as she moved with practiced grace. Her dark hair was pulled into a neat bun, and even from a distance, Rick could see the intensity in her expression. Controlled, precise, almost robotic. The other dancers followed in unison, their synchronization perfect, almost unnatural. But something about them seemed off. Their expressions were too blank, their movements too mechanical, as if they weren't simply dancing but following a program, a script ingrained into them over years of relentless training. Rick's jaw clenched. What the hell was this place? A sudden movement near the entrance caught his eye. A well-dressed man, one Rick recognized immediately from his research, Reuben Kendrick, the man who owned the theater. The one whose name was plastered all over the ballet company's history. He exuded authority, his cold, calculating gaze sweeping across the dancers like a collector admiring his most prized possessions. Rick's stomach turned. Then something else happened that made his blood run cold. The music stopped abruptly. The dancers froze in place as Reuben clapped his hands once. A moment of silence followed before he spoke, but Rick couldn't hear what he was saying. However, the effect on the dancers was instant. They bowed to him, their movements eerily synchronized. Then, without a single word, they turned and exited the grand hall in a perfectly coordinated line, like soldiers marching to their orders. Rick's stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't just ballet. This was something else. He needed to get closer. A desperate pursuit. Rick's hands gripped the steering wheel with white-knuckled intensity as he sped through the winding streets toward the Kendrick Grand Theater. His heartbeat roared in his ears, drowning out the low hum of the car engine. Every fiber of his being screamed that he was onto something real, something bigger than what the police were willing to believe. After 31 years of hoping, searching, and mourning a child he feared was lost forever, the glimmer of possibility was both exhilarating and terrifying. If he was wrong, this would only be another painful chapter in an endless cycle of disappointment. But if he was right, he shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The Kendrick Grand Theater was a well-respected institution, shrouded in exclusivity and prestige. Its name alone carried weight in the ballet world, a fortress of discipline and artistry. But beneath its polished reputation, Rick sensed something else: secrecy. There was little public information about the dancers who trained and performed there. Unlike other major ballet schools, the Kendrick Grand Theater never showcased its students in interviews, never shared behind-the-scenes glimpses of their training, and never allowed the media to document their process. The more Rick read about it, the more he felt a gnawing suspicion burrowing into his gut. When he pulled into the parking lot of the theater, his mind raced with conflicting emotions. The building loomed before him, its towering arches casting long shadows beneath the glow of the streetlights. The entrance was grand, with gilded double doors and elegant chandeliers illuminating the lobby inside. A sense of quiet luxury permeated the space, a stark contrast to the storm raging inside Rick. He cut the engine, his breath coming in slow, controlled exhales as he tried to steady his nerves. What was he even going to do? Walk in and demand to see a dancer he thought was his daughter? Would they laugh him out of the building? Or worse, would they silence him before he got the chance to ask questions? His fingers hovered over his phone. He should call Daniel. Get back up. But the fear of being talked out of this was too great. He couldn't risk hesitation. Not now. Swallowing hard, Rick opened the car door and stepped out into the cool night air. As he approached the entrance, he adjusted his jacket, trying to appear like he belonged. The last thing he needed was security stopping him before he could get inside. A uniformed doorman stood by the entrance, eyeing Rick with quiet suspicion. "The performance concluded hours ago, sir," the man said smoothly, his posture stiff with professionalism. "Unless you have an appointment, I'm afraid the theater is closed to the public." Rick forced a polite smile, fishing for the best lie he could conjure. "I'm with HCNV News," he said quickly, recalling the name of the media outlet that had aired the ballet performance. "I was covering tonight's event, but I need to confirm a few details about the dancers for an article. I won't take up much time." The doorman's expression barely flickered. He was trained well, unmoved by deception. "You'll need to schedule an official press inquiry with the director," he replied. "No unscheduled visits are allowed." Rick's pulse hammered in frustration. He was so close. He couldn't just turn around now. His mind whirled, grasping at alternatives. Then, in the periphery of his vision, he spotted something. Movement. A side entrance, slightly ajar, where a few of the theater's staff were stepping outside. This was his chance. Without thinking, Rick nodded politely at the doorman as if he were walking away, then swiftly turned, slipping into the shadows and making his way toward the side entrance. His heart pounded with every step, knowing he was crossing a dangerous line. If he was caught trespassing, they could have him arrested. But none of that mattered. If Claire was in there, he had to find her. He reached the open door and slipped inside, barely making a sound as he entered the dimly lit corridor. The air was thick with the scent of polished wood and faint traces of perfume. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with doors leading to dressing rooms and practice studios. A distant melody of classical piano echoed from somewhere deeper inside, haunting and ethereal. Rick pressed himself against the wall, his pulse hammering. He had no idea where to go, no clue what he was looking for, until suddenly he heard voices. Two figures emerged from one of the side rooms, a woman in an elegant navy blue dress and an older man in a tailored suit. They were engaged in hushed conversation, but as they passed beneath a light, Rick caught a glimpse of the man's face. His breath hitched. Reuben Kendrick. The name sent a shiver down Rick's spine. He had read about him during his frantic research. The founder of the Kendrick Grand Theater, a man of wealth, influence, and secrets. Rick ducked behind a pillar, listening intently. "Shouldn't have let them perform in public," the woman was saying, her voice tight with concern. "It was too risky. Someone might have recognized them." Reuben's reply was smooth, dismissive. "It was necessary. We have obligations to uphold. And besides, the girls are well-conditioned. They wouldn't dare question their purpose." A sickening realization churned in Rick's stomach. They were talking about the dancers, about keeping them hidden. He clenched his fists. They weren't just hiding them, they were controlling them. The conversation faded as the two walked further down the hall, disappearing into another room. Rick took a shaky breath, his mind racing. He needed to find Claire. Now. He moved carefully, scanning the doors as he passed. Most were locked, but then he saw it. A door slightly ajar, light spilling out from inside. He stepped closer, heart pounding. Peering inside, his breath caught in his throat. There she was. Claire, or Celeste, as she was now called, sat at a vanity, her hands resting delicately on the table. Her hair was swept into an elegant bun, her face serene yet distant, as if she were lost in thought. But it was her ballet slippers that seized Rick's attention, the bows. The same bows he had tied on his little girl's shoes all those years ago. His throat tightened. He wanted to call out, to rush inside, to tell her who he was. But before he could move, another figure entered the room, one of the theater's handlers. "It's time to return to your suite," the handler said gently. "The master will be visiting soon." Claire nodded wordlessly and stood. Her movements were graceful, almost mechanical. She had been trained into obedience, conditioned. Rick felt an unbearable mix of rage and heartbreak surge through him. He wanted to tear this place apart, but he had to be smart. He had come this far. He couldn't blow it now. As Claire left the room, Rick knew what he had to do. He couldn't just watch anymore. He had to get her out of here. The web of control. Rick's breath came in shallow, measured inhales as he pressed himself against the wall, waiting for the sound of Claire's, Celeste's, footsteps to fade. His body tensed, his heart hammering against his ribs as he processed what he had just witnessed. The Claire he had known was gone, or at least buried under years of conditioning, of control so absolute that even in solitude, she moved with rehearsed precision. He had seen it in her posture, in the blank serenity of her expression. She wasn't just living here, she was owned. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as rage burned in his veins. 31 years of grief, of waking up every morning with the ache of loss pressing against his chest. And all this time, his daughter had been alive, locked away behind gilded doors, turned into something unrecognizable. But she was still his, and he was going to bring her home. Rick forced himself to move, his muscles screaming with tension. He had to get out of here before he was caught. The walls of the Kendrick Grand Theater weren't just hiding a ballet school. They were hiding a prison. And if he wanted to free Claire, he needed to understand how it operated. He needed to tear it down from the inside. The hallways stretched before him like a labyrinth, lined with doors that whispered of secrets he wasn't yet ready to uncover. He needed a way out, fast. Every second he lingered was another second closer to discovery. He retraced his steps toward the side entrance, careful to avoid any more handlers or security guards. But just as he reached the final turn, his body went rigid. 2 guards stood by the door, their eyes scanning the hall with the precision of men trained to look for things that were out of place. Rick inhaled sharply, calculating. He could fight them. He had the training, the muscle memory. But that would only make things worse. He couldn't afford to be seen as a threat, not when he had already trespassed onto private property. If he was caught, there was no telling what they would do to him. He needed to disappear. His gaze darted to a small doorway at the far end of the hall. It was unmarked, slightly ajar, and most importantly, unguarded. He slipped inside, pressing the door shut behind him just as the guards turned in his direction. The room was dark, the air thick with the scent of dust and old books. His fingers fumbled for a light switch, and when he finally found it, his breath caught. This wasn't just a room. It was an archive. Rows upon rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, stacked with records that spanned decades. Rick's eyes roamed the shelves, his fingers itching to rip them open. If the Kendrick Grand Theater had been stealing girls, there had to be proof. With shaky hands, he grabbed the nearest file, flipping it open. His heart nearly stopped. Name: Elise Rowan. Age at admission: 5. Date of entry: 1995. Status: active performer. He flipped to the next file. Name: Helena White. Age at admission: 4. Date of entry: 1992. Status: active performer. Rick's hands trembled as he continued through the records. Every girl in this archive had been taken as a child. Every single one of them had vanished from the outside world, only to be absorbed into this twisted ballet machine. Then, finally, he found her. His breath hitched as his fingers brushed against a familiar name. Name: Claire Holloway. Age at admission: 4. Date of entry: 1994. Status: active performer. Renamed: Celeste Kendrick. The room seemed to spin around him. They had erased her identity. They had taken his daughter and turned her into someone else. Rick's grip tightened on the folder, the rage within him growing hotter, sharper. This wasn't just a ballet company. This was a cult, a system designed to strip children of their pasts, to mold them into perfect, obedient dancers for the amusement of the elite. He shoved the files back into place and turned toward the exit. He had seen enough. He had proof now. He was going to take this place down. But just as he reached for the doorknob, he heard a voice behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Rick froze. He turned slowly, his pulse hammering. Standing in the doorway was Celeste. Her dark eyes locked onto his with a strange mixture of curiosity and caution. She didn't look afraid, but she also didn't look like she recognized him. Rick's throat went dry. "Claire," he breathed. A flicker of something, confusion, recognition, crossed her face, but just as quickly it was gone. "My name is Celeste," she said softly. "Who are you?" Rick felt his world collapse. But he wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. "I'm your father," he whispered, stepping closer, his voice thick with emotion. "Claire, I've been looking for you for 31 years. Her breath hitched, but she shook her head, stepping back. "No, that's not possible." "Yes, it is," Rick insisted, his voice urgent. "You were taken from me. You were 4 years old. You used to love watching fireflies in the backyard. You had a stuffed rabbit named Poppy. I don't remember any of that." Her voice was trembling now, her carefully composed mask cracking. Rick took a deep breath, steadying himself. "They did this to you, Claire. They made you forget, but you can remember." Her fingers curled into fists. He could see the battle happening behind her eyes, the struggle between belief and conditioning. Then, suddenly, heavy footsteps echoed down the hall. Celeste's face went pale. "You have to go," she whispered harshly. "If they find you here." "I'm not leaving without you," Rick growled. But she wasn't listening anymore. She was already pushing him toward the door. "Go. Now." Rick hesitated for only a second before moving. He wasn't going to lose her again. He couldn't. As he slipped into the corridor, he caught one last glimpse of her, standing in the dim light, her expression unreadable. Then the door shut between them. Rick's hands curled into fists. This wasn't over. He was going to burn this place to the ground. The fractured mind. Rick's hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white against the cracked leather. The Kendrick Grand Theater faded into the distance behind him, its dark silhouette looming like a specter in his rearview mirror. His heart pounded in his chest, his mind a whirlwind of emotions. Rage, grief, desperation, all tangled together in a suffocating knot. Claire had been right there, standing in front of him, close enough to touch, yet she had looked at him as if he were a stranger. She didn't remember him. She didn't remember herself. They had taken her name, her past, her entire existence, and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Celeste Kendrick. That was the name they had forced upon her, burying Claire Holloway beneath years of manipulation and control. Rick clenched his jaw, his grip tightening on the wheel. He had come too far to let them win now. As he reached a red light, his phone buzzed against the dashboard. Daniel. With a deep breath, he grabbed the phone and answered. "Dan." "Jesus, Rick, where the hell are you?" Daniel's voice was sharp, laced with frustration and worry. "You sent me a damn text saying you were at the Kendrick Grand Theater. Then you go completely off the grid. What the hell were you thinking?" Rick exhaled heavily. He didn't have the patience for a lecture right now. "I found her," he said, his voice hoarse. Silence. "What?" Rick's throat tightened. "Claire. She's alive. She's there." Another silence. This time, heavier. Daniel finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure?" Rick swallowed the lump in his throat. "I spoke to her, Dan. I looked her in the eyes. She didn't recognize me. She doesn't even remember who she is." Daniel let out a slow, shaky breath. "Jesus Christ." Rick nodded, even though his brother couldn't see him. "It's worse than we thought. The Kendrick Grand Theater. It's not just a ballet school. It's a prison. These girls, they take them young, brainwash them, strip them of their pasts, and turned them into performers. Claire isn't the only one. There are dozens of them. A sharp intake of breath. Holy shit. I have proof, Rick continued, his mind racing. They have records, files on every girl they've taken. They changed their names, erased their identities, and conditioned them to believe that they were rescued. His fingers curled into fists. They stole her from me, Dan. They stole all of them. A beat of silence. Then Daniel's voice came, low and urgent. We need to go to the police. Rick hesitated, his gut twisting. I already tried. They won't believe me. Daniel cursed under his breath. So what do we do? Rick's jaw tightened. He already knew the answer. We get her out. Ourselves. It was well past midnight by the time Rick pulled up outside Daniel's house. His brother was waiting for him on the porch, arms crossed, face set in grim determination. As Rick stepped out of the car, Daniel wasted no time. Tell me everything. Rick exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. She's not just being held there. She wants to be there. She thinks she belongs there. They've brainwashed her into believing that Reuben Kendrick saved her. She calls him master. The words tasted like acid on his tongue. Daniel paled. That's Jesus. That's a cult, Rick. I know. Rick's voice was hard. And we're going to tear it down. Daniel let out a humorless laugh. Oh yeah. And how the hell do you plan on doing that? You saw how fortified that place was. You think we can just waltz in there and grab her? Rick's jaw clenched. I don't plan on grabbing just her. I plan on exposing them. Daniel's brows furrowed. Exposing them. Rick nodded. The media of Dan. The same people who covered that performance. If we can get them interested in the real story behind Kendrick Grand Theater, we can force the authorities to take action. We need to make sure the world sees what's really happening behind those walls. Daniel considered this for a moment, then exhaled heavily. That might actually work. But how the hell do we get that kind of attention? Rick's gaze darkened. We use her. Daniel's eyes widened in realization. Claire. She's their star dancer. Their perfect creation. If we can get her out, if we can get her to remember who she really is, then we have living proof of what they've done. Rick's fists clenched. She's the key to everything. Daniel hesitated. And what if she doesn't want to leave? Rick's stomach twisted. Then we make her remember. We make her see the truth. The next day, Rick and Daniel sat in front of Rick's laptop, scouring through news articles, trying to find a journalist willing to listen. Most of them were puff pieces, praising Kendrick Grand Theater as a beacon of artistic excellence. But then Rick found something. A blog. Not from a major news outlet, but from an independent investigative journalist, Alina Marquez. Her latest article was titled, Kendrick Grand Theater, A Legacy of Secrets. Rick's eyes widened. She already suspects something. Daniel leaned over his shoulder, reading the article. She talks about how no one outside of Kendrick's inner circle really knows anything about their dancers. No interviews, no public records, nothing. She says it's like they don't exist outside of performances. Rick nodded. She's on to something. She just doesn't have proof. Daniel smirked. Then let's give her some. Rick's fingers flew across the keyboard as he composed an email. Subject: URGENT. I have proof about Kendrick Grand Theater. Ms. Marquez, my name is Rick Holloway. 31 years ago, my daughter, Claire, was abducted along with her ballet team. The case went cold. No bodies, no leads, no hope. Last night, I found her. She's alive. She's there, at the Kendrick Grand Theater. They stole her identity. They brainwashed her. And she's not the only one. I have documents. I have names. If you want the truth, meet me. I don't want money. I don't want credit. I just want my daughter back. Rick hovered over the send button, his heart pounding. Then, with one final breath, he clicked it. Now, All he could do was wait and pray that it wasn't too late. The reckoning. The next 48 hours were the longest of Rick's life. Every ticking second felt like a hammer pounding against his patience, a cruel reminder that his daughter was still locked inside the fortress of control that was the Kendrick Grand Theater. He hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten. His mind had been consumed by two things, Claire and the plan. Then, late in the evening, his phone vibrated on the table. The moment he saw the name on the screen, his stomach clenched. Elena Marquez. He snatched the phone and answered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Marquez. The voice on the other end was sharp, professional, but tinged with curiosity. Rick Holloway, you sent me an email. Rick exhaled, gripping the phone tighter. I need to meet with you. This isn't just some conspiracy theory. This is real. My daughter is alive, and she's being held in that damn theater. There was a pause. Then, Elena's voice came through, low and thoughtful. I looked into your story. The Holloway case. Your daughter and her ballet team vanished 31 years ago. No traces, no bodies. Just gone. And now you're telling me she's alive, and she's been dancing under a different name. Yes, Rick confirmed, his jaw tightening. Not just her. Dozens of them. They've been taking little girls for years, raising them in isolation, training them, brainwashing them. I have proof. But I need someone who can help me expose this. Elena was silent for a moment. Then she said, where can we meet? Rick didn't hesitate. The old train station downtown. 1 hour. Come alone. The train station had been abandoned for over a decade, its rusted tracks overgrown with weeds, the old platform covered in graffiti and dust. Rick and Daniel waited in the shadows, their nerves stretched thin as the night air grew colder. Then headlights appeared in the distance. Rick stiffened as a sleek black car rolled into the lot, coming to a slow stop. The driver's side door opened, and a woman stepped out, a petite, sharp-featured woman with dark hair tied into a loose bun. She wore a leather jacket over a button-up blouse, her demeanor cautious but composed. Elena Marquez. She approached with measured steps, her eyes flickering between Rick and Daniel before stopping in front of them. All right, she said, crossing her arms. I'm here. Now show me. Rick pulled out the stack of stolen files, the ones he had taken from the theater's archives. He handed them to her without a word. Elena flipped through them, her brow furrowing deeper with every page she turned. Jesus Christ, she muttered under her breath. These are birth records. Name changes. Financial transactions linked to offshore accounts. She shook her head. This isn't just trafficking. This is a system. Rick nodded grimly. They'd been running this operation for decades. Rich families adopt these girls, but really they're being turned into elite ballet performers. These aren't students. They're property. Elena glanced up, her sharp brown eyes locking onto his. And you think if I break this story, the police will actually do something? They'll have no choice, Daniel cut in. This is the kind of scandal that can't be ignored. High society corruption, missing children, a secret organization built on abduction and control. If you publish this, it'll go viral. The whole world will see it. Elena studied them for a long moment, then exhaled. All right, she said finally. I'll run with it. But if I do this, you better be ready for war. Rick's eyes darkened. I've been ready for 31 years. The article dropped the next morning. It spread like wildfire. The key conspiracy, the dark truth behind BLETC. Exclusive investigation reveals decades of stolen children, brainwashing, and forced performance under the guise of artistic excellence. The story exploded across the internet. Social media platforms were flooded with discussions, debates, and horror. Parents of long-missing children came forward, demanding answers. Old cases that had been buried for years were suddenly thrust back into the spotlight. By midday, national news stations had picked it up. By evening, the police had no choice but to act. They were going in. Rick stood outside the Kendrick Grand Theater as police swarmed the building. The once untouchable fortress was now surrounded by flashing red and blue lights, officers shouting orders, their guns drawn as they forced their way inside. Reuben Kendrick was nowhere to be seen. But that didn't matter. Rick wasn't here for him. He was here for Claire. Through the chaos, he pushed past a wall of reporters, his pulse hammering as he entered the theater's grand hall. The dancers had been gathered by police, their expressions a mix of confusion and fear. Some clung to each other, while others stared blankly ahead, as if unable to process what was happening. And then he saw her. Celeste. She stood at the edge of the group, her posture perfect, her face eerily calm. The moment their eyes met, Rick felt his breath catch. She knew him now. Something in her expression shifted, a flicker of recognition breaking through the years of conditioning. Her lips parted, but no words came. Rick stepped forward, his hands trembling. "Claire," he whispered. She stared at him, her body rigid, her mind warring against everything she had been taught to believe. I don't." Her voice was barely audible, but it cracked at the edges. Rick reached into his pocket and pulled out an old photograph, the one he had carried with him for 31 years. He held it up, his eyes shining with desperation. "This is you," he said softly. "This was your life before they took you." Claire's gaze dropped to the photograph. A small girl in a blue tutu, smiling with unrestrained joy. A younger Rick holding her hand. A woman, her mother, standing beside them. Her breath hitched. Then something broke. Tears welled in her eyes, her chest rising and falling with uneven breaths. She clutched her head as if in pain, as if the very act of remembering was physically tearing her apart. Rick took a step closer, his voice shaking. "Come back to me, sweetheart. Please." A sob racked her body. Then, finally, "Dad." Rick's heart stopped. Then he was moving, crossing the space between them in 2 steps, pulling her into his arms before she could fall. She collapsed against him, her sobs breaking free, her body trembling as 31 years of stolen memories crashed back into place. Rick held her tightly, his own tears falling freely. "I've got you, baby," he whispered into her hair. "I've got you." And for the first time in 3 decades, he felt whole again. It took months for Claire to heal, for all the dancers to heal. The Kendrick Grand Theater was shut down, its elite members exposed, its hidden empire dismantled. Reuben Kendrick was found hiding in a luxury villa overseas. He was dragged back in handcuffs, charged with child abduction, conspiracy, and organized crime. But for Rick, justice wasn't found in a courtroom. Justice was the sound of his daughter's laughter filling his home again. Justice was finally hearing Claire say the words he had longed for his entire life. "I remember now, Dad. I remember everything." And with that, he could finally breathe.